Judges chapter 7, verses 1 through 15. We're going to take a big chunk out of this story this morning. Judges chapter 7, beginning with verse 1. Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead." So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. But the Lord said to Gideon, "There's still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say, 'This one shall go with you,' he shall go. But if I say, 'This one shall not go with you,' he shall not go." So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, "Separate those who lap the water with their tongues like a dog laps separate them from those who kneel down to drink." 300 men drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home." So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300 who took over the provisions and the trumpets of the others. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. During that night the Lord said to Gideon, "Get up, go down to the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp." So he and Purah, his servant, went down to the outpost of the camp. The Midianites and the Amalekites and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand of the seashore. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. "I had a dream," he was saying. "A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midian camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." His friend responded, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." Verse 15. When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshiped. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, "Get up! The Lord has given the Midian camp into your hands." Dividing the 300, the men went in 3 companies. He placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them, with torches inside. Have you ever admired somebody to such an extent that you tried to emulate them? Their characteristics, their manners, almost their DNA. You admired them so much, you tried to act like them. You tried to live like them because you wanted to be like them. You ever do that? I don't have to have a nod, because I know there's not a person in this room who hasn't done that. In fact, we're all a combination of the people in our lives that we've admired and tried to take a little bit from this person and a little bit of this person and we're a combination of the people that God has used to inspire us and make us better than what we are. Well, what if we wanted to do that with Gideon? This ordinary guy that God did extraordinary things through. What are some of the characteristics of Gideon that enabled him to do extraordinary things? 5 characteristics to emulate. Number 1, Gideon lived in the right place. Write that down. Gideon was living in the right place. Look at verse 1 again. Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The thing that stands out to me is where Gideon is living at that point. Before he was called, where was Gideon living? When this story begins, where do we find Gideon? He's in a thrashing floor. He's in a pit. He's in a hole in the ground because he fears the Midians. He's thrashing wheat, and he doesn't want the Midians to come and steal his wheat away. He's in a pit. Now he's out of the pit after God has called him. He's out of the pit, and he's living on the edge of a river, and across from him is his enemy. He's facing his enemy. Are you with me this morning? Where are you living? We've already talked about the fact you can't go beyond ordinary from a pit. So what are the pits in your life? It's not just where Gideon was physically, it's where he was spiritually. You know, there's nothing sinful about being in a thrashing floor. It's why you're there. He's living in the bondage of his fear. Where's your bondage this morning? Can you go beyond? Can God take you beyond ordinary from where you're living? David Jeremiah, in one of his books, makes the statement that you become what you worship. You become what you worship. So he says in his book, if you worship money, you begin to look like that. You begin to take the characteristics. You start getting greedy, or you start getting materialistic, or you start hoarding, or you start living in debt, or you start you have this rebellious spirit towards this whole business of honoring God with your stewardship of your tithe. You start taking on the characteristics of the thing you worship. Does that make sense to you? Or if he goes on, he talks about if you worship sex, you become sensual. It affects what you read. It affects what you look at. It affects your thinking. It affects how you relate to others, and maybe you become flirtatious because that's what you're worshiping. You become like that. Or if you're like Gideon, who's worshiping security, then you start looking like the God that you're worshiping, and you get fearful and you get intimidated and you have trouble taking God at his word with faith and taking risks. You start looking what you are worshiping. So what are you worshiping? Where are you living? Can God take you from where you are to where you need to be? Are you in the right place? He was living in the right place. He had moved from the bondage of the pit to facing his enemy. I could stay there a little while longer, but I guess I should move on. Number 2, the second characteristic we could emulate is he was listening to the right person. He was listening to the right person. Notice these verses. Verse 2, just this phrase. The Lord said to Gideon, you have too many men. Look at verse 4. But the Lord said to Gideon, there are still too many men. Look at verse 5. There the Lord told Gideon, separate those who lap the water. Look at verse 7. The Lord said to Gideon, with 300 men, I will save you. 2 observations about those verses and this conversation. Number one, the number one thing I can pull away from those verses is this. If the people you are listening to, if you never get ticked at them, you're probably listening to the wrong people. Because there's not a lot of affirmation in those verses. I mean, everything God is saying to Gideon isn't warm and fuzzy until the very end when he says, I'll save you, but I'll save you about 300 guys. If the people that you're listening to, all they say is what you hear, all they say is what you want to hear or listen to, then you're listening to the wrong people. The people that have spoken into me and made me better are the ones that have often critiqued in love. Do you have anybody like that? Does anybody tick you off in your inner circle? So many times. Now, you got to earn the right with me. I don't listen to just anybody. But if you've earned the right and you say something that kind of takes me to a dark place, then if it's the truth, the Lord has this habit of coming in behind you and stirring the dust within me. He says, John, you really ought to listen to that. And those are the things that have helped me the most. 1,000 times more than those who just say what my itching ears want to hear. Are you with me? Does anybody tick you off in your inner circle? You're not listening to the right people. Second thing I notice about this conversation is that it's ongoing. You know, we've talked through the years, we've talked about the times when God has spoken, and usually it's very brief and it changes everything. It's kind of like an edict. Like God speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, you know, and just comes, your hair's all white and, you know, everything changes, you know. But this is different. This isn't some big edict, one-time short thing and you're done. He's in conversation. He's got more than one thing to say. You know, and the longer you go at this, the better you get in having conversation with him. It takes a little while. And you know, this gets me in hot water with some of you. I still haven't heard his audible voice. So some of you younger Christians, don't think you're missing out because you haven't heard his audible voice. I never have. But we've had great conversation in here. You know, if some of you treated your spouse the way you treated the Lord, you know, you'd be in a little bit of trouble. What if with your spouse, the only time you communicated with her is on Sunday morning? That's it. And you brought her a box of chocolates, you know, really good chocolates, and you had, you know, a morning conversation with, and then the rest of the week, you don't talk to her at all. I know what some of you ladies are thinking. You're thinking, that's the best conversation I've had in 25 years. You know, I wish it was that much, you know. You can't let God take you where you need to go unless you learn how to hear his voice and communicate with him on an ongoing, regular basis. Does that make sense? Boy, I'd have more to say on that one too. Some of the best stuff is the stuff I never say. I'll just say this. I'll just say it. Not only is it critical to listen to the right person, but by virtue of that, you also need to learn how to not listen to the wrong person. You know, we've talked about that just a couple of weeks ago in another series about guarding your ears. You ever hear of a doctor named Dr. Theodore Morell? Any of you ever hear that doctor, Dr. Theodore Morell? Any of you? Oh, you would have loved him if you had ever gotten to meet him. He was charismatic. He was the life of the party. But he also knew how to listen. And many times, you know how it is when you're socializing with a doctor and it's just so easy to say, Doc, I got this pain, And so, he's got to put on his doctor's hat, and even though he's at a party, and, try to help you out. And this one up-and-coming guy meets Dr. Morrell at a party. He's a real mover and shaker, and he says something like that, and Dr. Morrell listens to him and says, suggests, you might want to try this. Well, that thing changed everything. And for that guy, it changed his world. And from that moment on, he hung on every word that doctor told him. And he never felt better for years. Until all of a sudden, after about 10 years, he begins to develop a tremor in his right hand. And he starts shuffling a little, and his complexion turns gray, and he starts stuttering some. He's got glassy eyes. And he starts aging rapidly. In fact, he almost ages a year for every month. Until eventually that really sharp upcoming guy poisons his wife, and at 56 years of age blows his head off. You know what that guy's name was? Adolf Hitler. And for the last 10 years of his life, he was on 28 different drugs, including speed. Be careful who you listen to. It's not just a matter of listening to the right guy. It's not listening to the wrong guy. Does that make sense? The Bible says in Jeremiah 23, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Do not listen to what the prophets are prophesying to you. They fill you with false hopes. They speak visions of their own minds, not from the mouth of the Lord. New Testament, 2 Timothy chapter 4. For the time will come when people will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them great numbers of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. They will turn their ears away from the truth and turn aside to myths. Be careful who you listen to. Number 3. The third characteristic that we could emulate from Gideon is he was lifting up the right priorities. He was lifting up the right priorities. In verses 2 and 3 it says, the Lord said to Gideon, you have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel will boast against me. My own strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. Focusing on the right priorities. You know, when you're up against an army who's described like locusts, when you're up against an army that's described that their camels can't be numbered any more than the sand of the sea, it would be pretty easy, wouldn't it, to focus on the size of your army instead of the size of your God? Wouldn't that be easy? Wouldn't it be easy when you're facing an invading army to stop focusing on the important thing and start focusing on the expedient thing, the thing that's right in front of you? But according to verses 2 and 3, in spite of all that, Gideon keeps his focus on his God. And that's what saved his bacon. Keep your eyes on the important thing. Not the expedient thing. Not this thing you see right in front of your face. Just because it's in front of you doesn't mean it's the most important thing. You know, I once heard Charlie Grimman, he was the manager of the Chicago Cubs. You know, we're right in the middle of the World Series. Some of you stayed up late to watch it, I can tell. And he was one of the best managers in Cubs history. And he gets a phone call from one of his scouts. And his scout says, you know, Charlie, I just saw the greatest pitcher I've ever seen. He pitched a perfect game. No one even got a bat on the ball until the middle of the 9th inning when one guy hit a foul ball. And he's standing right here. Do you want to talk to him? You want us to sign him up? And you know what Charlie says? He says, no, forget about that guy. Find the guy that hit the foul ball. We don't need pitchers, we need hitters. Keep your eye on the priority. That guy goes on and wins 3 national pennants and is one of the best managers in Major League history. Keep your eye on the priorities. The Bible says, seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Matthew 23, Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. The first and greatest commandment. Guys, bless your hearts. I want to say this cautiously and lovingly. Some of you are battling cancer. You can't afford to make the highest priority of your life to eliminate cancer. It's got to be Jesus. Some of you are in the grips of debt. You're about to go under. You cannot make the focus of your life more money. It's got to be Jesus. Some of you are facing a terribly damaged marriage, and if something doesn't happen, you're going to lose it. That's rough. But you cannot afford to make the focus the highest priority of your life to heal that marriage. Doesn't that sound harsh? Doesn't that sound harsh? It's got to be Jesus. Everything else falls into place after that. So what's your highest priority? If it's not Him, you're not going to get to go where He wants you to go. Keep the first thing first. Are we okay with that? Am I in the fourth one? The fourth characteristic? The fourth characteristic to emulate from Gideon, he was leaning on the right people. He was depending on the right people. And this is 4 through 8. I'm only going to read a section of it. But the Lord said to Gideon, there are still too many men. Take them to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. And you know what the story is. They go down to the water, and some guys, they get down on their knee, if I can get down this far, and they bring the water to their lips, and they lap it like a dog. Others, they get flat on their face, and they stick their face in the water because they're that thirsty. And you know what they do with that? They take their eyes off the horizon. They take their eyes off the enemy. Their whole focus is, I'm thirsty and I want something to drink. Versus the other guys, they keep their eye on the priority and they bring, listen to me, they're just as thirsty as the other boys. That's not the difference. They're just as thirsty. But they keep their focus on the enemy and they bring the water to them. And that's the ones that Gideon gets to keep. And you know what we learn from that? You know what the moral of that story is? It's better to run with 300 with their hearts in it than 32,000 with their hearts divided. In the first thinning out, it's fear. If they're afraid, let them go home because fear is contagious. And in the second thinning out, it's selfishness, taking their eyes off the mark. Everything becomes their own comfort. Let them go home because that's contagious too. Better to run with 300 that are all out than 32,000 that have divided heart. Who you running with? Who you leaning on? It's so easy to take your eye off the mark. I've seen it in so many So many avenues. I've seen it in churches. Every church battles it. They first start off and their eyes are on the harvest fields, and they want to reach unsaved for Christ, and their passion is so hot for the mission. It determines what they sing and how they sing it. It determines what they do and how they do it. It determines who they hire and how they hire them. It's all for the goal of reaching the lost. But as time goes on, it's easy to lose that passion and start focusing on self. And so we choose the songs that satisfy us. And we choose the ministries that touch us. And we hire the people that stroke us. Something's happened. We've lost the focus. And if you run with people like that, you will lose the focus. Does that make sense? I've seen it in people's careers. I've seen, I don't want to pick on you medical guys. I love you to death. But some have been called, early on they've been called to medical missions. They go out on some mission team and man, they get passionate. And they go to school because God has called them to medical missions. But oftentimes, you know what happens? They come out of residency and they have all this debt because it's very expensive to get through medical school and all that. And so they got to take care of their debt. So they start practicing in the States and they start hiring this nurse and that nurse. Then you know they need this expensive piece of equipment, and then they need another piece of equipment. And pretty soon their overhead gets so heavy. And the times they go out on missions is less and less. And the time they spend in the States and on their practice is more and more until they never go. Something's happened. They've taken their eye off the ball. They've missed what God has called them to. And it's not just those boys, it's all of us. Now this, man, I've been debating all week whether to go here. It happens in politics. I had one guy this morning say, I'm so glad the election, what is it next week, I think? Get rid of all these commercials, you know. Everybody tearing down everybody else. It doesn't matter what the label is. You know what I'm convinced of? I can see some, oh, here he goes. You pray for me in the next minute. I'm convinced whether it's Republican or Democrat, doesn't matter. I'm convinced they start off with good intentions. I'm convinced of that. They want to do something good for the country. They want to do something good for their constituents, if I can get that out. But you know, when they win and they start running with the other boys and gals that are either in Richmond or D.C., something happens. They lose their focus. It's no longer about country and what's best for country or even their own constituents. It's what is best for this party they're in. Doesn't matter what the label is. Are you hearing me on this? Boy, I could go deep in that, but boy, then I really get in deep grass. So I won't, but be careful who you lean on. Don't lose the main thing. You ever hear the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing? Whether it's politics or whether it's your career or whether it's your church, God has a mission. You want to run with big dogs. Remember, was it just a couple weeks ago I might have shared that General Westmoreland back in the Vietnam days, and he's inspecting the troops, and he's inspecting a bunch of paratroopers. I don't know if it's 82nd or 101st, but maybe a combination of both. And he's going down the lines, and he's inspecting the soldiers, and he stops in front of one guy. If you remember the account, and he says, "How do you like paratroopers, son?" And he says, "I love it, sir. It's my life." And he goes down to the next guy and he says, "How do you like paratroopers, son?" I said, "I love it, sir. I love jumping out of airplanes." He goes down to the third guy. How do you like it, son?" He says, "I live for it every day. I can't wait. I wish I could go out today." And he goes to this guy at the end of the line and he says, "How do you like paratroopers, son?" It's a true story. He says, "I hate it, sir." And it takes him back and he says, "What?" He says, "I can't stand it." And he says, "Well, son, why do you do it? It's a voluntary thing. You don't have to be in this unit if you don't want to be. Remember what he says? Because I like running with big dogs. I like running with men who like to jump out of airplanes. I want to be like them. I don't like it. I just want to run with them. I want to be in their number. Who you running with? Who you leaning on? You can't go beyond ordinary when you're running with wrong people. When you're leaning on wrong people. Last thing I want to share, this characteristic that we should try to emulate out of Gideon is this. He was looking at the right problem with the right perspective. This is absolutely huge. I hope I can get this out right. He was looking at the right problem with the right perspective. And this comes from this last section of verse 8 all the way down through verse 15. I'm not going to even read it again. It'd take too much time. But basically, the Lord is saying, Gideon, tomorrow is the day. We're attacking tomorrow. But if you're afraid, I want you to take your servant and I want you to shimmy down to the Midian camp. And I'll show you something that will encourage you. Well, he is afraid. Not trembling with panic, but he's a little afraid. And so he takes his servant and he shimmies on down. He crosses the river and he goes to the Midian camp and he hears these two boys, these two soldiers talking. And one is saying that he had a lousy night and he had this terrible dream. It kept him up all night. And the other boy says, well, what was the dream? And he says, well, it was this big round loaf of bread and it was rolling down the hill and it hit this tent and it wiped everything out. And the other boy gets all scared and he says, well, you know what that means? You know what that means? He says, no, I don't know what. The bread is Gideon, the sword of Gideon, and the tent is the camp of the Midianites. This dream means that God has given us into the hands of Gideon. This is terrible, and this fear spreads through the whole camp. And oh, Gideon, he's getting happy. He's starting to worship because he's hearing that his enemy isn't as scary as he thought they were. Not as intimidated as he once was. These guys aren't invincible. They can be beat. Guys, listen to me. Some of you, you're scared. You're staring right at a huge army. I don't know what it is. It might be cancer. It might be a bad marriage. It might be debt. It might be drugs. But it's scary. And it looks like it's impossible. God can't take you where you need to go if you're intimidated by them and whatever's out there. Whatever you're facing, you've got to face it in the light of the cross and an empty tomb. You got to see your enemy in the light of who your God is, not who you are. A couple months ago, John McCain died. And they had two funerals. Did any of you watch any of that? They had the funeral in the National Cathedral. That's not the one that really sent me. It was the first one. He had two funerals. The other was in Phoenix, Arizona, at First Phoenix Baptist Church. And I heard that Joe Biden was going to speak. Now, sometimes Joe drives me nuts. But sometimes he hits it out of the park. And because he was a Democrat and McCain was a Republican, I really wanted to hear what he had to say. And at times he had shared some great experiences of them together. They used to sit together. One would go across the aisle and sit by the other one. You're not supposed to do that, The Republican boys over here, Democrat boys over here. Well, sometimes one would cry and they would go either way. And the others would get upset at them because, they weren't keeping proper decorum or whatever. But there was this, in spite of their differences, there was this relationship. And so I just wanted to see it. And he didn't disappoint. And someday I'm going to share the golden nugget of what he said because it was gold. but not today. The guy that absolutely brought it was the guy right before him, who I had never heard before. His name was Grant Woods, and he was John McCain's chief of staff. And he comes up there. You know, guys, I've done a lot of eulogies in my day. And if you think about it, the number one enemy besides Satan is death. We all have an unavoidable appointment with it. And if we're honest, it scares us. And so this guy, the place is packed. And whenever you attend a funeral, you're always reminded of your own unavoidable appointment. Someday it's going to be you laying in that thing, you know? And we're not sure how we feel about that, but it's coming anyway. And he comes up to help these guys face all this. And I mean, he slam dunks it the best I ever heard. And he relates two things that I'm going to have to give a Reader's Digest version. He talks about when McCain was in the Hanoi Hilton, or if not the Hanoi Hilton, something like it. And it's Christmas. And he told this story many times. And they're all gathered around this bare, naked light bulb. You know what I'm talking about. Just a light bulb hanging from a rafter. And it's late at night. It's Christmas Eve. And they're singing carols, Christmas carols, in the prison. And McCain is leading he's leading them in his favorite carol, which is Silent Night. And Grant starts quoting it. He says, "Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. Round young virgin, mother and child, holy infant, tender and mild." And then he stops. He stops in mid-song. He doesn't finish it. And you're sitting there, I was sitting there, man, there's more to this. And instead of finishing it, he goes on to another experience that McCain had around Christmas time. He was being interrogated. It wasn't going well. His captors were frustrated with him. He wasn't giving them the answers he wanted. And so at the end of it, they tied him. You know, he had something wrong with his shoulders. He couldn't raise his arms beyond this. And oftentimes it was because they tied him so tight behind this high-back chair that it would pull his shoulders out of their sockets. And it was terribly painful. And they left him there. They all left and went home and had their supper and went to bed. But they left McCain with those ropes tied tightly, whereas he was in total agony. And around 10 o'clock at night, all of a sudden the door opens. And this guard comes in that he has never met, never laid eyes on. And he comes in behind and he loosens McCain's ropes and releases some of that pain. And he walks out, leaves him there. And he comes back at 4 a.m, right before his shift is over. And he tightens them back up again. So he wouldn't get in trouble and McCain wouldn't get in trouble. And he never sees him again for 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, he's out in the compound, just standing there, and all of a sudden, he sees this guard again. And the guard comes up and just stands beside him. He doesn't say anything to him. Sorry, my nose around. That's not part of the story. And without a word, he takes his sandal and he does this. He steps back. And just for a minute, they stare at the cross. And after just a few minutes, he takes his sandal and he brushes it out and walks away. McCain said it was the defining moment of his captivity. From that moment on, he saw his captors in the light of a cross and an empty tomb. And Grant, he's telling this story. He's got us. He's got it. He had me in my living room watching on TV. He had me right there. And he comes to the end of his eulogy, and he says, John McCain, senator from Arizona, served his country with honor, fought the good fight, finished the race, kept the faith. And then he walks out from behind the podium and he does this. And he walks back behind the podium and he says, now we can finish the song. Sleep in heavenly peace, John McCain. Sleep in heavenly peace. And he walks off to a standing ovation in a funeral. I mean, he nailed it. I've thought about that. And some of the pain and agony we're facing. "11 people shot yesterday in a synagogue. Are you kidding me? 2 of them cops. Letter bombs sent to some of the most prominent people all over the country. Are you kidding me? Seriously? A father kills his infant daughter this week and buries her in a shallow grave. Seriously? The next Army sergeant who just has come back from 2 terms in the Middle East, and he brings that stuff with him. He's not there, but it's still in here. And he shoots his wife and his neighbor dead. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright, round young virgin, mother and child, holy infant, so tender and mild. Sleep in heavenly